Welcome to this session on literary criticism, where we would look into certain other aspects of feminist criticism as explained by Maggie Hum. We begin with postmodernism. Frederick Jameson, in the essay Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, argues that whereas modernism played an oppositional and marginal role within Victorian and Edwardian bourgeois society, postmodernism attends to all the new fashions of contemporary consumer society. In the postmodern society, cultural signs are manipulated and recirculated. Jean-Francois Lyotard's The Postmodern Condition, regarded as a key text of postmodernism, offers cultural and economic explanations for the new closure of boundaries between high and low culture and for the way in which culture can endlessly synthesize and reconstitute art forms. Postmodernism expresses its hostility to totalizing discourses or master languages. Postmodernism is self-reflexive, but modern literature is often an eclectic combination of literary constructs. Feminism and postmodernism share some common characteristics, namely a concern to challenge the barriers between the dominant and the marginal, as well as to challenge canonic genres. They undermine capitalism and celebration of great artists and universalization of white, middle class, masculine values. They recognize gender to be a historical and shifting construct. The first postmodern analysis of gender and aesthetics is Rosalind Krauss' essay, The Originality of the Avant-Garde, a postmodernist repetition. Since postmodernism, according to Krauss, questions the concept of origin and masculine individualism, it offers progressive possibilities for women. Feminist critics share the postmodern perception that any destabilizing of ownership challenges political certainties. Postmodern writing is marked by self-reflexivity, interweaving of autobiography, theory and literary criticism. Contemporary women writers use postmodern techniques in order to comment on their own meaning-making process as part of the content of their fiction. These writers utilize fragments of contemporary culture and past history and delight in intertextuality and parody. Hum argues that the female experience in general is closed postmodernism because women have always been marginal to the social order and frequently had to understand double languages, the language of the home and the language of institutions such as schools. With this background, we move on to the analysis of Fay Weldon's Female Friends and Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar. The passage from Female Friends looks like a piece of romance. The vocabulary expresses a dream that a strong man, asserting his masculine superiority, will save and raise the social status of a poorer and usually a plainer woman. Typically, a romance heroine is extremely passive, which is encouraged by the use of third-person point of view, as is this passage. Romance does not question the myth of male superiority or the primacy of heterosexual relationships. The passage is, however, postmodern because it challenges all the assumptions of masculinity. Patrick's strong masculine authority is a parody, and there is a strong authoritative narrating voice that gently and ironically deflates the norms of romance along with its hero. The fragmented paragraphs and multi-generic movements make the process of writing part of the content of the passage. Weldon neither privileges one genre above another, nor does she privilege any single voice. Moreover, the fact that events are told rather than shown is a characteristic device of parody. Female Friends is a feminist postmodern novel because it blurs narrative distinction in order to throw into question constructions of female sexuality and supposed lack of moral authority. Sylvia Plath's The Bell Jar is regarded as a key text of contemporary feminist literature. Both formally and thematically, the novel critiques the patriarchal institutions through an exploration of sexual politics and psychoanalysis. The novel is interpreted as a representation of female schizophrenia or the divided self caused by a masculine world. Narrated by the author in first person, the novel describes Esther Greenwood's failed suicide attempts to come to terms with the world. Many critics have been tempted to read the novel as Plath's autobiography. Postmodern fiction is self-conscious and critical about the act of self-reflexivity. Plath seems to flaunt the demands of a realist autobiography, parodying Esther's obsessive attempts to accurately reflect her social world. The novel also explains Esther's complex relationship with her mother and has often been read as a conflict novel about mother-daughter symbiosis. The given passage could be considered postmodern because popular culture is a major part of Esther's means of experiencing the world. Esther's rejection of marriage and her sense of self-identity are imaged by a very positive, phallic image of a 4th of July rocket, which is immediately juxtaposed with the formulaic writing of detective thrillers. Plath's use of contradictory voices and multi-genres is thoroughly postmodern. Plath utilizes the types of popular culture enjoyed by most readers and challenges representations of gender identity. We shall now move on to black feminisms. Black feminist criticism argues that both criticism and fiction are narratives which represent race in particular ways. An important concern of many black feminist critics is to make historical understanding a significant part of critical analysis. Black feminist critics focus on representations of memory to a rather unusual extent. Zora Neale Hurston's "Their Eyes Were Watching God" is a good example of how a black woman survives by means of what Toni Morrison calls re-memory, which is a continual movement to and fro between past and present. Until the 1970s, black women were misrepresented or marginalized in most critical texts. Anthologies did not mention the works of black women. The writings of Afro-American women are absent in black literary histories written by men. Alice Walker mentions that black cultural heritage exists outside the academy with its own very special interactive epistemology and deep roots in African culture. Walker argues that oral stories told by female ancestors have equal value with written texts. Many of Walker's key images of women are drawn from African oral cultures and myths. Barbara Smith's pioneering essay toward a black feminist criticism in 1977 pays attention to black aesthetics. Smith describes the tasks of black feminist criticism. First, it must challenge the centered and centering male Western tradition with readings of difference such as black lesbian novel. Second, Smith defines a black feminist standpoint which builds on a notion of autonomy, not separatism. Smith coined the term simultaneity of discourse to define black feminist criticism, which is a way of reading that focuses on the interrelation of the discourses of race, gender and sexuality. Zora Neale Hurston's work is of interest because she is seen as a mother of 20th century black women's writing, having contributed 4 novels, 2 books of folklore and an autobiography between 1934 and 1948. Second, her texts reflect those tensions of audience and self involved in an imbroglio involving race, sex and class. Third, Hurston's literary career throws up questions about traditions and the academy, since she is an active participant in the academic world. Hurston's term niggerati for the black literati intelligentsia of that period reveals her sense of the ambiguous state of black literature. While male black writers were in effect creating a masculine Negro canon, Hurston returned to her southern roots to search out a very different culture of black rituals, songs and proverbs. Hurston's novel challenges realism and deals directly with the empowerment of women. Black literature shows how women have struggled to liberate themselves from apartheid. Women in South Africa point to the destruction of black families by apartheid. South African feminists argue that black women suffer national, class or tribal and gender oppressions whose representations necessitate more complex cultural critiques. Black feminist criticism aims to widen traditional literary history to include black women writers, eradicate stereotypes of black femininity, and to address the question of audience and relations between black writers and black and white readers. Barbara Christian argues that black feminist cultural or materialist readings are grounded in the concerns of the black community and in a continuing dialogue with sexual politics. Black feminist criticism looks for symbols and objects and narratives which are the repertoire of the community, not those from psychobiography. Symbols are frequently chosen which reconcile individual characters with communities. Therefore, everyday objects become important cultural emblems. The repetitive use of these symbols combines to give a sense of a strong collective history. Place is important in black feminist criticism. Local and regional cultures with themes of place, landscape and domestic interiors are important. Black feminist texts organize writing to resist colonial dominations and misrepresentations. Literature and popular culture could be discursive instruments of future power. Black feminist writing suggests that the personal is always bound up with the political, and domestic and sensual descriptions often have metaphoric importance. Metaphors like the blanket organize the narrator's objective experience in the passage, allowing her to present the mother to be a respectable person and also offer the reader a structured passage into the author's more private and emotional experiences. Barbara Christian calls for positive images for rememory and becomes a heterogeneous signifier of black poverty as well as an emblem of personal or communal pride. The author's multiple discourses, her struggle in writing match very well black feminists' attention to narratives which are cultural histories of black women's struggles and resistance. Let us now analyze Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God and Ellen Kuzvayo's Call Me Woman. In the passage from Their Eyes Were Watching God, Hurston appears to narrate Janie's story only in third person. However, this is soon interrupted when Janie refuses the traditional authoritative stand. She refuses to use normal courtroom speech and prefers proverbs. Her narrative shows a black frame of reference and way of thinking. She expresses a complex sense of time and memory, and her alternative personal identity acts as a kind of resistance. She gains a psychic, cultural and linguistic presence through her act of re-entering her memory and unfolding her past in a different time and space. The passage highlights black feminist issues of race and gender difference. The episode demonstrates the importance of performance by showing how the meanings of various discourses can be applied. The passage also focuses on issues of public and private speaking, which confront black women daily in a white-dominated society. The representation of two distinct ways of speaking therefore exposes racial and cultural identities. Janie's ability to code switch between these demonstrates the function of translation in a racially divided world. Janie, the heroine, demonstrates how the gaining of black female identity and independence comes from relinquishing masculine frameworks and learning to combine private and public languages. In the passage from Call Me Woman, the libolo or circumcision ceremony forms a backdrop, and certain aspects of the ceremony are detailed by using metaphors. There is a permanent struggle with the text, of which the passage is a good example. Kuzvayo gazes at the girls who are from the different Basotho tribe and objectifies their difference. She adopts the typical narrative tone of a colonial ethnographer. While Kuzvayo is the innocent, respectable little girl, the other girls are alien, not frightening. Their representation acts as a simile for absences in black Christian upbringing. The images draw on several traditional narrative conventions of the primitive and the exotic related to people who have little education. The subordination of the individuality of the girls to the unity of the dance is in strong contrast to Kuzvayo's role as a narrator, where she makes a distinction between a moral observing subject, Kuzvayo, and an immoral subject, the native girls. Kuzvayo depicts a world of mystery, joy and beauty, where individual identity begins from common rituals. Her reconstruction of memories reveals a love for the other, which transforms her view of present oppressions and becomes a solution to apartheid. She gives a central place to the black female body, and through this the understanding that black women can be part of the non-oppressive world. In black feminist criticism, the body is an emblem of cultural resistance. Call Me a Woman is not a private, personal account of struggle and a journey to success, but a charting of multiple and banned black identities. We now move on to lesbian criticism. Hum notes that the label lesbian is often used negatively. However, lesbian critics turned the negative into positive by arguing that lesbian texts will usually be ignored and surface as non-canonical, but they would eventually subvert heterosexual writing. The notion that the difference of sexuality must shape the representation of sexuality itself is intensely problematic. The main points of discussion related to lesbian criticism are: how far are lesbian representations regarded as essentially different from feminine representation or from feminist? It is observed that issues of historical construction, self and social censorship and language are tied together. Another issue is whether a lesbian reading is essentially different, or could this be constructed or chosen, and what does difference like black or white inform the different lesbian readers. A lesbian reading must allow space for recognitions and identifications and must create a sense of ownership for a lesbian reader. Lesbian criticism sometimes focuses on undermining realism to describe lesbian experiences that have been marginal. Sometimes it could create a lesbian space for the reader and the author. Lesbian criticism addresses several areas like female narrators and heroines and processes of subjectivity and social construction. Textual messages depend on analogy, metaphor and simile. Autobiography and representations of eroticism may frequently involve the strategies of displacement. Many of these features appear in heterosexual as well as lesbian texts, and lesbian critics often turn to historical differences in writing. Black lesbians face particular problems claiming identity when representations of race and sexuality are split and contradictory. Identity is further problematized socially by the post-structuralist ideas of fragment itself, which denies a public black self to the black lesbians. The main aim of lesbian criticism is to clarify the ways in which critics can discover a lesbian aesthetic in a wide range of texts. Adrienne Rich's When We Dead Awaken, writing as revision, addresses issues of visibility and invisibility, looking with fresh eyes, and the need for a new literary history and new critical principles. the writings would give importance to retrieving lost women writers and attention to mothering, and also cover a wide range of subjective, autobiographical and physical experiences. Barbara Smith, in her 1977 essay Toward a Black Feminist Criticism, extends the boundaries of black lesbian criticism by including texts previously assumed heterosexual. Ellie Balkin celebrates the possible lesbian role models ignored by traditional literary history. Lesbian critics argue that feminist criticism committed to representations of sexual difference would take a very different form by being open to new kinds of syntax and new vocabulary. They suggest that all criticism is ideological, not simply that produced by lesbian critics. All criticism is culturally constructed that reflect particular historical values. Lesbian critics take much more readily to both popular and high art. They are attracted to works that illustrate fluid ego boundaries, such as the fluidity of mother-daughter representations. We move on to analysis of Sidonie Gabrielle Colette's Claudine at School and Audrey Lorde's Zami. Claudine at School was published in 1900 when homosocial writing was prominent, but lesbian writing lacked literary and cultural space. She wrote the novel for her husband, Henry Gauthier Villiers, under compulsion as a collection of memories of her own education. Colette's writing is a good example of historical limitations because representations of sexualities remained constrained by rules of masculine and feminine behavior for a long time. One dominant problem of lesbian criticism is related to deciphering, silencing of suppressed cultures and evaluating writing like Colette's that existed earlier than second wave literature. According to critics Marx and Stambolian, this novel is a novel of the gynecium. Such novels describe the women identified worlds of girls' school and college, and as such are frequently a focus of lesbian criticism. Descriptions of warm female friendships and schoolgirl eroticisms form the focus of study. According to lesbian theorists, a lesbian is a woman who believes in the primacy of women. A lesbian is a source of an alternative model of a female identity and not simply a choice of sexual activity. However, later theorists would focus more on sexuality. Judith Butler suggests that a postmodern concept of the lesbian utilizes parody and performance which challenge the construction of heterosexuality. In contrast, Monique Wittig mentions that lesbians are not women because the sign woman carries with it several constructions and associations. According to Wittig, lesbian is an outside sexual category and therefore outside literary constructions. In her own work, she subverts linguistic order by allowing pronouns and characters to mingle and fuse as in J bar E. This questioning of identity is also expressed by Judith Butler, who suggests a postmodern concept of lesbian by making use of parody and performance to destabilize the construction of heterosexuality. Colette dispenses with social constructions of masculinity. Her heroes frequently have feminine traits. Gender ambiguity extends into Colette's choice vocabulary and representations of eroticism. Colette deliberately searches of unusual metaphors and invents nouns in order to subvert conventional and stereotypical representations. In the passage, descriptions of social relationship elaborate Claudine's jealous reaction to a possible liaison between Amy and the young male master Armand Duplessis, which she aims to block. She creates a triad of female homosocial desire. Lesbian bonding involves the open suppression of heterosexuality, and for this the male must be diminished. Audrey Lorde is a black feminist lesbian poet, autobiographer and critic. she calls herself Sister Outsider, as she is claiming a tension between identities and creating a connection between two contradictory positions. She invented a new critical term for a metaphorical investigation called biomythography, or composite representation of mothers, friends and lovers. This term is carefully chosen to mark the ways in which gay people's past are constructed as mythologies. For many black critics, consciousness is part of Afrocentric feminism, which draws on African religions, the values of languages of black communities, orality and cultural significance of mothering. Zami is an autobiography that details Lorde's childhood in the New York of the 1940s and her subsequent sexual, political and work experiences in America and Mexico. Zami is a term from the Caribbean that means women identified women. Lorde aims to describe lesbian race and class difference in her novel. She divides her story into three phases. First, early childhood, family and school experiences. Second, strong female friendship and gradual move away from her mother psychologically and in reality. And third, friendship with women and her growing social experience and understanding of lesbian lifestyle. The passage points out how Lorde depicts lesbian identity as close to a mother's nurturance and sexuality. She gains her identity through identifying with her mother and not objectifying the mother. Her claim is that her lesbian drives stem from and return to her maternal body. She symbolizes and brings into narrative play a continuous dependence on the maternal, which she believes is part of lesbian identity. She gives a semiotic account of that world of jouissance experienced by mother and child that revolves around the sensuality of touch, sound and smell. The recreation of psychic, incestuous and sensuality experienced by mothers and daughters is her contribution to lesbian literature. After this, we move on to third world feminisms. Hum points out that the history of European colonialism has a same time frame as the history of the European novel. Fundamental hostility and fear of others, particularly female others, at the heart of patriarchal imperial project, binary opposition between colonized people and white exploiters, and the literary representations of that oppositions in contrast of black or white or progressive time are seen to depend crucially on the repression of women. Third world is preferred because the term encompasses a political position and underlines the similarity between white oppressions in the USA and Europe and imperial oppressions elsewhere. Chandra Mohanty Talpade, Gayatri Spivak Chakravarti and Gloria Anzaldúa argue that third world feminist criticism engages with ideas from first and third worlds and offer a multiple unity of international sisterhood. Disciplines and techniques including psychoanalytic deconstruction, semiotics and cultural history display unequal relations between the imperial West and marginalized non-West are represented discursively in gendered terms. The best example is how black women are conflated with nature, animals or the exotic in Heart of Darkness. Third world feminist criticism favors deconstruction because the constructed Eurocentric narrative perspective often breaks revealingly when it tries to distance women as others. Third world feminist critics deconstruct imperial narratives in breaks and absences, in gender representations in order to question racist and misogynistic stereotypes. Chandra Talpade Mohanty argues that imperial texts construct two artificial entities, the colonizer and the colonized, because textual implications allow the colonized only those representations derived from the colonizer. Examples from Heart of Darkness include images of the veiled woman, the powerful mother, the chaste virgin and the obedient wife. Two myths about black women are the native women as outside the progressive time or history of the colonizer and therefore represent primitive values. The second myth is that native women encapsulate the natural or exotic and therefore appear most threatening and different to the imperial invader. Third world feminist criticism considers psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic terms such as fetishism, meaning the obsessive erotic satisfaction some men gain from single female features such as hair or shoes, are often deployed by the third world feminist critics. In novels, the whole female body may be fetishized in order to counter the threat of sexual difference and women's independence. The fetishism of the author is transparent, and the imperialist substitutes natural or generic categories for those that are socially constructed. Black is related to emotion and white to rational are the extremes of imperial gender representations. Third world feminists attack two key features of mainstream literary theory: its use of literary conventions which are shaped by dominant social ideals, and its belief in the power of a Western canon of great literary masterpieces. Let's analyze Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Jean Rhys' White Sargasso Sea. Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness sketches the social and cultural representations of imperialism that project a glorious and self-contained European view. Conrad problematizes the nature of imperial values by problematizing the notion of a coherent, stable, unchanging narrator who is the hero whose ideology depends on the subordination of others. The novel is also termed one of the most important and mythic novels written in English. The novel critiques imperialism by presenting the colonial experience as demoralizing for the colonialists and colonized alike. Behind this surface, it reveals realistic and historical details. The novel presents the European imperial figure and interrelation of patriarchal and imperial ideas. Marlowe, the protagonist, provides a different account of black and white women in the novel. The passage from Heart of Darkness is a first-person male narrative which is objective and maintains distance. The character Marlowe uses vocabulary drawn from 19th century traveller stories, where Africa is a strange, primitive, erotic place. Marlowe stands back from any personal feeling, allowing emotions to be displaced onto the woman he describes in the passage. He objectifies her by not representing her qualities, but her figure as a symbol of the mysterious life of the jungle. The woman is an object, not a subject. In his account, Marlowe, the colonizer, is able to mythologize Africa itself as female, treacherous and desirable, needing a firm and paternal European control. The entry of the woman has no narrative status in the novel, and she is given no independent African power. The scene intersects black gender oppression with colonial oppression. The passage in White Sargasso Sea presents issues such as black or white representations, and the title reflects the sense of the impossibility of an easy passage through history and representations. Sargasso Sea is a still, warm part of the Atlantic Ocean in which light winds and seaweed combine to prevent ships from passing through with ease. The sea metaphorically lies between the England of the imperial character, Mr. Rochester, and the Caribbean home of the colonized Creole woman, Antoinette. In the passage, the family garden is a convincing image of the power of the semiotic. It is the maternal space of Antoinette's childhood. Third world feminists would draw attention to the religious significance of the tree of life and tree ferns, as well as their tropical intensity. Coulibaly stands for the wild zone of Antoinette's childhood before her abusive marriage to Rochester. The passage is constructed from opposites like dead, fresh, living, snaky, twisted or bell-shaped. These are not pictures of black and white women like the opposite and distinct portraits drawn by white imperialists. The passage is written in first person and explores her interior thoughts, her sensation of sense, very sweet and strong, and her feelings of enchantment. However, there are contradictory and complex experiences. The passage which represent her verbal dexterity and her strong independent sensuality. The garden is clearly a woman's sight, displaying the power of Creole female sexuality. Questions of ethnicity and gender become inevitable from questions of environment, of place, and ultimately of power. Rhys seriously and imaginatively questions about colonial female identity and subjectivity and patriarchal domination, sexual or racial constructions of imperialism, and the impact of all these on literary conventions and forms. The objectification of a Creole woman as a doll is a key example of patriarchal imperialism. Rhys fishers colonialism with discrete breaks. First, she limits her patriarchal imperial territorial control in favor of the warm semiotic colibri. Second, she contrasts Creole and black multiple histories and memories with more limited patriarchal chronology. Third, world feminist critics would celebrate her taming of patriarchal imperialism as well as her more complex matrices of motherland. Let us summarize what we have done so far. Postmodern perception, according to feminist postmodern critics, destabilizes ownership and challenges political certainties. Postmodern writing is characterized by self-reflexivity, interweaving of autobiography, theory and literary criticism. Contemporary women writers use several postmodern strategies in order to comment on the unique process of deciphering meaning, which is a part of their fiction. Black literature shows how women have struggled to liberate themselves from apartheid that destroyed several families in the African continent. South African feminists argue that black women suffer national, class or tribal and gender oppressions whose representations necessitate more complex cultural critiques. Black feminist criticism is expansive and includes black women writers' efforts to eradicate stereotypes of black femininity and to address the question of audience and relations between black writers and readers who are black and white. Lesbian criticism is primarily concerned with processes of subjectivity and social construction. Textual messages are carried through analogy, metaphor and simile. Autobiography and representations of eroticism may frequently involve the strategies of displacement. Many of these features appear in heterosexual as well as lesbian texts, and lesbian critics often turn to historical differences in writing. Third world feminist criticism deconstructs Eurocentric narrative perspective that tries to distance women as others. Third world feminist critics deconstruct imperial narratives in breaks and absences in gender representations in order to question racist and misogynistic stereotypes. Disciplines such as psychoanalysis, deconstruction, semiotics and cultural history display unequal relations between the imperial West and marginalized non-West are represented discursively in gendered terms. We do have questions for you that would enable you to understand the module better and find out what Maggie Hum has discussed. All these weeks we have discussed several areas that come under literary criticism, and I do hope that the time that you have spent with me would have been useful in understanding several concepts related to literary theory and criticism. Thank you for being with me. Until we meet next time, bye.